Since the dawn of sequencers and DAWs, probably even a little bit before then, people have been focused on how to get out of the loops that they often feel stuck in. There's been lots of talk online about how to escape the loop. I might have even contributed to that talk a little bit over the years. But the thing is, sometimes I really like to loop, and for me, as a person with a classical background, it was a very different way of working that I found really intriguing in terms of how I could layer sound design and things like that I had never really experimented with before. And over the past 10 years, I've used a significant number of loops in various ways in my own music. So today, instead of trying to escape the loop or get out of loops or stop using loops, I want to talk about how to make better ones that are more interesting and that we actually want to hear over and over, because that's kind of the point. Great loops have two properties. They don't spoil the repeat before it happens, and that's something that in composition we call telegraphing. You give away the punchline before we get there. And they tell some kind of self-contained story and have their own musical shape. They themselves function like a sort of musical phrase. By the way, I have an entire ebook that's absolutely free on composition and some of these principles that I think are the most useful and have been the most helpful to me over the years. That's the first link down in the description below if you would like to check that out. It also goes into more detail about how to, develop your pieces from loop into an entire arrangement, which is kind of the escaping the loop thing that we talked about before. But let's stay focused on loops for this video. One of the most common things that I hear in the loops that just don't do it for me is that they spoil the repeat by hinting at it first. The chord at the end of the loop that is supposed to set up the repeat already gives away too much of the first chord of the loop that we come back to, so it's telegraphed. Or we might simply just have the same chord that we come back to too many times. Like if it's an 8-chord progression and 4 of the chords are C, then that gets really old. It feels like a centering chord that makes this whole thing feel like it's not progressing or going anywhere. So I like to take this to the other extreme and use a technique that's almost from serialism, which means that I never return to the same chord twice within a loop. Or if I just have like a 2-part sequence that loops, I don't ever want to repeat any of those notes again within the same sequence. And if that sounds tricky, just remember that most loops are fairly short, so it's not like you have to go through 12-tone serialism and use all of the notes of the chromatic scale before you come back around and then things get very dissonant. They don't actually have to be all that dissonant, especially if we're just dealing with like a 4-chord progression. A clear example of this is in my track Somewhat the Same from a couple of years ago, where I use this exact technique and I just create this looping progression that stubbornly repeats throughout the track while other things happen around it. But the loop itself had to be interesting enough that it wanted to be repeated. And I took a lot of care in figuring out how the last chord or the last intervals in the sequence would relate back to the first chord in the sequence, and make sure that I set up some sort of harmonic freshness every time that loop repeated. That simply means that I have it telegraphed from the last chord of the sequence to the first chord, the repeat. And once I have that established, it just took some experimentation to find a progression that I liked, the way that it looped. I was able to explore other variables with that loop as my anchor, like melody, texture, sound design. All of these things give the track its sense of progression and arrangement. But it always feels tethered to something, and that something is a very strong loop that I've set up. I just did a composition cohort with a handful of folks who all went through this process of exercises and figuring out how to write in this way together. And there are a couple members in there who have more of a science background. And we just started using the scientific term for the thing that doesn't change in an experiment. It's the thing that allows you to know if your experiments are working or not. It's your control. And I love thinking about it this way. You need one thing to anchor you while you make experiments around it. And those experiments were the other things that I mentioned, the variables of melody, sound design, instrumentation, all of that stuff. Your loop can tell a story, and I think this is one benefit that I had coming from a classical background, is I had seen so many incredible examples of phrase shapes and gestures and things that just work really well from master composers who already knew how to do this stuff and how to communicate in a way musically that felt like a conversation. I may not have known what a compressor was or an oscillator from a hole in the ground, but I did understand how even the most simple gestures can really glue a piece or glue a phrase together. So using that same example of somewhat the same, if we look at it carefully, we notice that the outer parts in that loop, in that progression, have an outward motion to them. This is called contrary motion. They're moving in opposite directions. Something that if you know about, Bach or counterpoint, you are pretty familiar with. And this outward motion provides a very distinct characteristic. It gives both parts a greater sense of independence, while also establishing this very strong gesture that is highly recognizable. If we really want to get into the weeds here of what I'm doing, what I'm thinking about when I go through the process of part writing, even if it's just two parts, I'm actively avoiding doubling. I make sure, since I only have two parts to work with, if those parts ever share the same note, double, that means that I've eliminated a part. Essentially, that the harmony gets skinnier at that particular moment. That's why I avoid things like parallel octaves at all costs, because at that point I've eliminated one of my two parts. So does this mean that I never ever double anything? No, absolutely not. There is a place for doubling, but I understand the effect that it has so that I don't accidentally eliminate some of my very important parts that I have. And if I only have two of them, probably don't want to eliminate one. So I can always go back and make adjustments, but I find that I come up with the most interesting loops and the most interesting material in general when I try to start from the place of more rich harmonic possibilities. And we do that by actively avoiding doubling. Because doubling is often, if we're keyboard players especially, that's often where we're comfortable and where our fingers naturally want to take us. And that's when you fall into the trap of everything starting to sound the same, like stuff you've done before. And I often miss out on my favorite moments if I don't give myself this sort of intentional limitation of avoiding doubling. So both of these parts, the outer parts of this progression, have their own shape to them. They are distinct, they are independent, they are memorable, they're like tiny melodies in and of themselves. So take some time to think about what sort of shapes and gestures you want your own loops to have that might make them more memorable and make them stand out a bit more. Because if we enjoy this self-contained journey or musical story that our loops tell in and of themselves, it's like a self-contained little piece, and we don't spoil the ending, the punchline, before we actually get to the repeat, then we stand a pretty good chance of getting a lot more mileage out of loops. So once you have a few highly loopable loops, there's still the matter of figuring out how to arrange them and layer them and connect them, put them together in ways that aren't quite so predictable. And if you'd like to see an entire video where I talk about a track that I made using this exact looping technique and how to arrange loops, you need to watch this video right here.